Alright, tonight's video, we're going to be doing the exhaust manifold side. So we will start with replacing or putting the exhaust manifold back on. We will be putting the AC bracket back on. We'll also be putting the front motor mount on. We will put the engine back on the engine lift. Put the clutch back into place. And I believe that's about it. We got a bracket that's going to go on the head that we need to mount to hold the engine, lift the engine up. Let's go ahead and get started. See you on the side. We've installed the starter, the purge solenoid. Remember, this purge solenoid goes up to the top. That cable's actually broke. So I need to, actually this tube right here goes to the engine bay. There's another tube that comes from here that goes up into the top of this. But this connects actually to the inside of the engine bay. So we installed the purge solenoid, the crank sensor, the knock sensor, the oil pressure switch, the two engine blocks. They're like freeze plugs, but engine blocks. The alternator is connected to the starter. We do have another cable that comes from the car that's going to connect here as well. We installed the oil pump, the power steering pump with those two bolts, that bolt there, and these two bolts down here. Okay, we've also installed the idler pulley, the tensioner pulley, the alternator. This we already did. We installed the water pump, all of the gear on top of the intake manifold, the injectors, the throttle plate, throttle body, EGR valve. This is our throttle positioning sensor, and I believe this is our mass airflow sensor, if I'm correct. The exhaust manifold, we will install the lower motor mount, which goes right here, and I believe that's it. So we have the lower motor mount to install, the bracket for the top of the head, the exhaust manifold, the AC bracket, and I believe that's it. So yeah. Oh, and also we have the coil pack and spark plugs to install, and then our old clutch. All right, now our first step, we have the Torx E7 and the studs, same as we did on the intake manifold side. We're going to thread these in with the Torx bit facing out. We're going to tighten these down. Then we'll put the spark plugs back in. Then we'll put the exhaust manifold into place. All right, our next step, we're going to put the spark plugs in. Get those threaded into position. Now the spark plugs you can actually put in, after the exhaust manifold, but since we have it off, and it's easier just to do it right now. So we'll go ahead and put the spark plugs in. Alright, these are 13 millimeter. And once again, we're going to start from the inside and kind of work our way out. Just kind of tightening it down evenly. That way that the manifold does not warp. If you just kind of go through and snug everything up and then come back and do your final torque measurements. I believe this is about 35 foot-pounds. I'm not going to torque it, but I will just put a little extra wrench on it. Alright, now that we got the exhaust manifold in place, I'm going to install the AC bracket. Now just double check, make sure that you have it on the correct way. It will only go on one direction. And we have 4 10 millimeter bolts to secure this in place. Okay, the next part is the front of the AC bracket. Now, it's kind of a tricky one. Down here on the bottom you have 2 bolts. Both are 13 millimeter. This actually connects to the block. Alright? So I'll hand thread those 2 bolts in there. And then this top one is a 10 millimeter and it bolts to the top of the head. Now what I recommend is just snug these up. This bracket and this bracket, just kind of snug them. Because then when we get it to put in the car and we mount the AC pump in here, we want to have a little bit of flexibility so that we can line up the bolt holes for the air compressor for the AC pump. So I'm just going to snug these up by hand with the wrench. Alright, on this last clip I said just kind of snug this up. I just remembered this is actually where the mounts are going to be mounted to connect the chain. So we want to make sure that we do get these nice and tight, just because that's where it's going to be mounted so that the engine lift can hold it. So just put a little extra pressure on that, and then once it's in the car we may have to back these off a little bit to just kind of line up the AC pump. Here I am on the back of the engine. We have 2 10 millimeter bolts that we are going to use to tighten down this bracket. Now this bracket is what we use for the other side of the engine lift chain. Will connect to here. So we also want to make sure that those are nice and tight and not just kind of threaded on there by hand. You want to make sure you wrench them down so that they're nice and snug when we hook up the engine lift chain. And then the only thing that will be left is to hook up the front motor mount and then remove it from the engine lift or engine stand and put the clutch in. We'll do that next. Okay, now we're going to go and install the O2 sensor. Now this we may remove as we're installing the engine, because I remember that it was kind of tight. So we're just going to snug it in place just so you know where it's at. But we probably will remove this when we install the engine. Okay, one of our last steps. We're going to connect the motor mount. Now, when we install this, we'll probably end up removing this as well, just so that we don't have it in the way. But I'm just going to show you where it actually goes. So you have 4 13 millimeter bolts. Okay, 2 on this side. And then there are 2 over here on this other side, and then we will zip those down, and then we have 1 more bolt that goes right here, and this is where it threads into the actual cradle underneath the car. So that's how the motor mount works. Go ahead and tighten those down now. Okay, this bracket is probably another bracket that we will actually remove when we install the engine, but the way it goes in, just like this, and there's a little bolt that goes, a little brass fitting that goes into the head. Just thread that into there. Then there is a little 8 millimeter bolt that connects this to this bracket right here, and then there is another 8 millimeter bolt that connects this line to the valve cover. We'll go ahead and do that now. Alright, this right here is a 10 millimeter. Now I could use my socket wrench if I choose to. Just going to do this by hand. And then right over here we have an 8 millimeter. And then I'll just snug this down on this side over here. Okay, now I'm going to just install the spark plug wires. Now I still have to mount the coil pack, but it actually mounts to the transmission. So this will be positioned over here like this. So I will just put the plug wires in. Now I didn't replace the plug wires, but so they're still in their location. Then when I mount the coil pack, it'll mount right here, and this will be ready to go. All right, now that we got everything mounted, got the brackets mounted, got the engine lift hooked up to the engine hoist, now we're just going to go ahead and raise it up and remove this bracket. All right, here on this bottom one, since this didn't have any threads in the block, what we had to use was a bolt that we got from our local hardware store. And so if you go to mount this engine, you're going to need to get the same type of system. All right, first thing we need to do, put the pressure plate on. Make sure you put it on the right direction. And it's a pretty snug fit, so make sure you don't let go until you have a bolt threaded in. Okay, the last thing that we need to do before we put the engine in is put the clutch in. The way this goes in, only one way. You see it's not lined up. Flip it over like this. Okay, and then our clutch plate goes in the middle. Here's our flywheel, our clutch plate, and our actuator plate. Okay, so then we just line this up. All right, and then we'll put the bolts in and then tighten it down. All right, so we're pretty much done rebuilding the engine. Now we're going to go ahead and put it in the car. But that's going to be it for this series. We will have another video next week on actually installing the engine. So I hope you guys learned something about how this engine's set up. We will put the belt on before we put it inside the car. Get everything all cleared out of the way. AC bracket, clutches in place, throttle bodies on. So it's pretty much ready to go in. What do you think, Brandon, of the build?
It's pretty fun.
Is it pretty fun?
Yeah.
Are you excited to do another one? We gotta do the Corvette.
Yeah.
So we're gonna do another one. We're gonna build a Corvette engine in the Astrovan, so that'll be our next engine build. But we will also make a video on installing this and showing you how to hook everything back up. So until next week, we will see you later. Please rate, subscribe, and comment, and we will talk to you next week.